Welcome back to part two of this, I admit, rather late part of my 2022 winter series. I'm Raj Kletke and we'll be looking mainly at fishing blue-wing olive hatches, but we'll briefly look at several other mayfly hatches also that fish, I believe, a little differently. You'll remember from the hatch chart from part one that blue-wing olives potentially emerge throughout the normal fishing season, and you should always be thinking about a possible blue-wing olive emergence whenever on the water. They're not as consistent a hatch as the trichos were that we talked about in part one, but on overcast days they will still be a very common hatch. There are blue-wing olives that are exceptions, but for now a quick identification of most, but not all, blue-wing olives is a small mayfly, hook size 18 or smaller, with two tails. The nymph is a small swimmer nymph. The reason blue-wing olive hatches are so common is because blue-wing olive is a general term and a common term for many different mayfly species, even mayflies from different families which have three tails and are crawler nymphs. But thankfully, you don't really have to know what specific species is hatching, because it's usually adequate to just subclassify these small mayflies even further by size, as the emergence pattern is very similar for all. Just change the size of the flies being used. Blue-wing olives are surface emergers, which is what many of us think of when we say hatch. It means that the nymph rises to the surface, the thorax splits, and the adult starts to emerge in various stages, ultimately riding as a dun on the water surface. But these are small mayflies, and especially on quiet water, some won't make it through the surface tension and end up as stillborns or cripples. But others will ultimately emerge on the surface, drop their nymphal skin, and ride the surface for a variable period of time before flying away. Incidentally, this is clearly not a blue-wing olive, but you can see the attached nymphal skin, which we now usually call a shuck. Of course, many other common mayflies, usually slightly larger than blue-wing olives, also have surface emergences, so you can fish them in a similar manner to what we'll be discussing. But blue-wing olive hatches are very common, so that's what we're concentrating on now. As I said in part one, remember the three main considerations for any hatch. Recognizing a blue-wing olive hatch may be very easy or very difficult. A super hatch or even a moderate hatch you won't likely miss, as there's rising fish and you usually see the duns riding on the surface. But a sparse blue-wing olive emergence are hard to recognize and are missed by many fishermen. So again, always be thinking about a possible blue-wing olive hatch. In Iowa and out west, most of the blue-wing olive hatches that I've seen have been in mid-afternoon, but I've seen them as early as noon and as late as the evening when it's starting to get dark, and I was actually expecting a caddis emergence. Occasionally, you may just see swooping swallows without obvious insects, so you know that something is hatching. It could be caddis, it could be midges, or sparse blue-wing olives. If it's in the afternoon or about the same time you saw blue-wing olive the days before, think about blue-wing olives first. Sometimes the clues for an imminent hatch are quite subtle. More than once the clue was that in the early afternoon I was no longer catching fish on my zebra midge that I was using as a dropper, and it had been working all morning. I'd replace the zebra midge with a small, often beadhead pheasant-tail nymph and again start catching trout. The pre-emergent hatch was on. Sometimes only a very sparse emergence hatch followed that might otherwise have been easily missed. Occasionally the clue was that the trout were now taking my pheasant-tail nymph that was being used as a dropper off my searching nymph pattern. Choosing the correct fly is much more difficult than choosing the tricho spinner, as I discussed in part one, as not always the same stage of the blue-wing olive meets all these criteria, and different trout may be taking different stages. So multiple patterns may be needed, and unlike the tricho spinner, where changing patterns hasn't greatly helped me, changing patterns in a mayfly emergence has sometimes made a dramatic difference. So let's quickly look at the flies I use. My most commonly used flies include the pheasant-tail nymph, which is a great imitation of a blue-wing olive nymph, which is useful for the pre-emergence hatch and sometimes during the early emergence when it's fished close to the surface. It also functions quite well as a searching nymph in streams that have blue-winged olives. You'll commonly need emergers, and I happen to like the WD-40 and the loop-wing emerger. This simple wrap is my usual blue-wing olive dun or late-stage emerger if you view the tail as a shuck. It commonly works well, and it's easy to tie in the very small sizes that are required. Rarely, if the simple wrap doesn't work, I'll get out my quad or a small parachute, and sometimes this will help. And of course, I carry soft hackles for almost all mayflies and caddis, as these may represent a cripple, stillborn, an emerger, or maybe just something vulnerable and edible. Just remember, these are small and skinny flies. This is actually one of the larger blue-winged olive nymphs you'll see. I tie most of my blue-winged olive patterns with a 5mm body and a 7mm wing, often on a size 20 hook. And the tiny blue-winged olives I'll tie down to size 22 and 24. There are a few blue-winged olives that are size 16, but size 18 is really the largest I usually carry for blue-winged olives. Should you use the same flies? Maybe not. There are likely hundreds of patterns for blue-winged olives. Fly shops are happy to sell you the current local favorites, and they're favorites because they work. You may already have your favorite patterns also. Remember, you fish better and more intently with a fly that you have confidence in and therefore catch more fish. Just be sure that the size matches the blue-winged olives that are emerging. You already know the basic techniques, as they are the same as we used for the trico spinner fall. If you didn't see part 1 of this series, you'll have to go back to that video, and I think it's worth your time, as the same techniques are used for many hatches. But very briefly, I usually fish a riffle, quartering upstream, and fish downstream on quiet water. Usually I'll catch more fish easier in riffles, but the larger trout will often be in quieter water, so I like to look for rising fish in quiet water. It's not all that complicated, but let's quickly review what I usually do. When on the stream, I'm always thinking about a possible blue-winged olive hatch, especially if there was one the day before, or if I know that blue-winged olives are commonly on that stream. Starting around noon or later, I'll start adding a small pheasant-tail nymph, perhaps a beadhead to the rig that I'm already fishing. Usually a dropper off an attractor dry fly, commonly an elk-hair caddis, or off my attractor nymph if I'm fishing deep. If I start seeing even a few rising fish when I'm expecting a blue-winged olive hatch, I'll put on a simple wrap and try fishing that. If the simple wrap isn't taking fish, I may put back on a pheasant-tail nymph or an emerger as a dropper. Once surface activity is established, I'll usually fish with just the simple wrap and usually will take some fish. Blue-winged olive duns often ride the surface for quite a while, so they're vulnerable and concentrated. In moderate to heavy emergences, they are also very numerous. If my simple wrap isn't working, especially if the rise forms have no bubbles, implying that the fish are taking something subsurface and I'm not seeing duns being taken, I'll add an emerger as a dropper. Emergers are vulnerable, concentrated in or just under the surface, and are often as numerous as duns. They may also take surface-shy trout. Unlike during the trico spinner fall, changing the pattern in a mayfly emergence may make the difference between no strikes and lots of strikes, so do not be shy about changing flies. Sometimes during a super heavy hatch, I'll put on my simple wrap with a dropper emerger to start with. Just catching trout during these times may be a numbers game like fishing the trico spinner fall, so I keep casting and find myself sometimes frantically changing things long past any rational idea why. I should go look for easier fish, but I usually don't. So what changes do I make before I get totally frustrated? If you're having trouble with any surface hatch, or for that matter, almost any hatch in general, you should consider these steps. Remember, the general rule for most hatches is that if what you're doing is not working, change something. Here, commonly, you'll need to go to a smaller fly. A lot of us, especially if all we've done is estimated the size of the fly from what we saw flying, will overestimate the size. So try to catch a fly and make sure that you're fishing with the proper size fly, or cast your fly next to some duns on the surface and see if it looks right. If there's any question, always go to a smaller fly. Also, a lot of times these blue wing olive hatches are in the afternoon, and I've been fishing all day with the same tippet and may have changed flies. My tippet often has gotten way too short. You should always use at least a 3-foot tippet when fishing these tiny flies, is because that is what helps prevent the micro drag. You can go to a thinner tippet, and I'll go down to a 6X, not infrequently. I usually don't go to a 7, even though that might be better, but I've lost too many fish on a 7X tippet. And of course, as we talked about, if they're not taking your surface fly, consider going subsurface with an emerger, and always consider adding a soft hackle pattern. While I recommend the previous steps, it doesn't always work, or they don't always work. Some people do recommend fishing under the emergence with a nymph, and early during an emergence, that sometimes does seem to work, but later in the emergence, when the surface activity is well established, the duns, the early and late stage emergers, the cripples, they're all concentrated in or on the surface or just slightly below the surface. So they're the most numerous and the most vulnerable, and so I have not had good luck trying to fish deep under an emergence at this stage with a nymph. But try it if you want to. Before leaving mayfly hatches, let's quickly look at two other types of emergences. Cephalonurus and Isonychia are fairly large swimming mayflies, and they emerge out of the water pretty much like stoneflies, so you won't be fishing an emergence hatch. You may see these mayflies. They're larger than most blue wing olives flying around. You'll see them, but you won't see rising fish. It's probably best to just stick with your attractor patterns until something becomes more defined. You may, however, see these in a spinner fall. So if you see rising fish, look on the surface for any spinners, and if you see them, obviously start fishing a spinner fall. Many of the clinger mayflies, also known as fast water nymphs, even though some of them are not always in that fast a water, tend to migrate to slower water before emerging, and they often emerge subsurface. A few emerge near the bottom of the river or stream, but many more emerge from their nymphal skins or shucks just a few inches below the surface and make the final ascent as a bedraggled dun. Once they get to the surface, the dun is hydrophobic, so some of these will fly quickly away. These mayflies are generally larger than the blue wing olives, but they also have two tails. During these subsurface emergences, I've caught a few trout on surface duns, but generally I've done much better with soft hackles, which I think represent the bedraggled dun as it comes the last few inches to the surface. Swinging the soft hackle with a few small twitches, which I think represents the dun trying to emerge from the nymphal skin just below the surface, has worked best for me. Again, these are small movements, however. I think the direction of the swing, fast water to slow water, may be important, but I haven't had enough experience with this to fully test this idea out. This is a March Brown pattern that I sometimes use, and this is one of my favorite soft hackles. It's a size 14 partridge in orange. I use this also for March Browns and other fast water mayfly emergences. I'll commonly use it after a major emergence of many mayflies has ended, but trout are still looking up, or occasionally just for searching, especially if you're seeing a few rising fish and you're not sure what they're rising to. I tie it in yellow, green, and purple bodies also. The yellow one is the one that I use for the western pale evening dun. The Midwest and Eastern pale evening dun, however, is a different species of mayfly and is a surface emerger. Note, I usually tie it what I call North Country style with a short body, so ignoring the hook, it looks smaller than a size 14. Longer hackle replaces the need for a tail. Tie some up, wet them, and you'll see what they look like. This is a very underutilized fly pattern in my opinion. If you want to see more of how I fish blue wing olives and how I tie some of the flies discussed, please review the original Fly Fishing Hatches series. But that's all for now and for the 2022 winter series. Again, I apologize for not having any really new material this year, but hopefully I have some ideas for next year, and I hope to have new and interesting material for the 2023 winter series. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you then.